What's up, guys? Recently I've been reading Golden Age Batman comics, so I thought I would do a little retrospective on them and let you guys know if it's actually worth reading them today. Batman in the Golden Age was a lot different than he is now. Nowadays he's known for having a pretty large cast, lots of villains, but that wasn't always the case. In the Golden Age he was a lot more of a solo hero. Eventually he got Robin. So a lot has changed. So I thought I would just go over my thoughts on what I think about the Golden Age Batman comics. Is it worth reading today? And so on. So I wanted to start out by talking about the actual heroes themselves. So Batman and Robin. Batman was introduced in Detective Comics 27. He became a pretty quickly popular character. His character at the time was kind of in lieu of like the Shadow or the Phantom. He was more of just like a kind of like a pulp hero. He fought a lot of gangsters. He didn't really have supervillains until later on, which I'll talk about soon. But as a hero, he wasn't really that well characterized. The early Batman comics, we see Bruce Wayne briefly at the start of most issues, talking a lot with Commissioner Gordon, who was there since Detective Comics 27. He didn't have a Batcave at this time. We didn't really know much about his backstory until a little bit in either. But Batman as a hero was a lot more kind of violent at first. He would kill a lot of people, which is definitely a far cry from what we expect to see from him today in movies and comics and such. But he was really kind of just a vessel for these crime comics. It was kind of just the gimmick that he was Batman. Later on, in Detective Comics 38, they would end up introducing Robin, who was basically just a kid's sidekick, kind of someone for him to bounce exposition off of. In the early days, Batman would kind of talk aloud a lot, kind of narrate what he was doing in his adventures, so it was quite a bit different once Robin was introduced because now he had someone to bounce exposition off. A lot of that would take place at the end of the comic when they kind of explain the moral of the adventure or whatever, or beforehand they would talk about stuff. Batman would have a hunch or something. He would send Robin to do his side work that he didn't have time to do, or whatever the case may be. But Robin was a fairly integral character. A lot of the times he did kind of end up being sort of a plot device for Batman having to save somebody. Countless early Batman stories had Robin getting hit over the head or something and then captured, and Batman would have to save him. So Robin was more of a plot device than a real character. We never really got that much with him. Sometimes Batman would put him in like disguise and he would go undercover. You know, the story reason is that he's a teammate for Batman, but as a plot device, it usually seemed like Robin was more of just a damsel in distress kind of. We also had his girlfriend Julie early on. She would basically be captured, or for some reason mobsters would want to kill her, and Batman would save her. Once Robin came in the picture, she became a lot less important, and they kind of ended up phasing her out eventually. But, you know, at the time, she was a somewhat important character, at least for that first year of Batman. As a lot of people know, and I think it's kind of a misconception almost, Batman would use a gun often early on. That's not really the case. He would use it occasionally. Like early on in one of the early Detective Comics stories, he ended up shooting two vampires with a gun with like a silver bullet to kill them because they were too dangerous to keep alive or whatever. But as far as it goes, Batman was never like, he wasn't like using guns as much as I think people kind of believe he did. But he was definitely more violent at first, for sure. Once they brought Robin in, that was another thing that kind of started to get phased out, and Batman started to kind of swear off weapons later, but early on that wasn't really a concern for him. A lot of things that we consider key now to the Batman lore, like the Batcave, the Batmobile, Alfred, a lot of that stuff was kind of introduced later on. Alfred wouldn't be introduced till 1943. The Batcave would be introduced around this time too. There wasn't a lot of like detective work or like anything like that early on in the stories. A lot of the times it would be like Bruce Wayne was talking to Dick Grayson. They would go out on the town, notice a crime basically, and then they would fight it or something around those lines. Things like the Batmobile, as we know it, weren't the same when they originated. Originally the Batmobile was like a red convertible, and then a year on they changed it to a more recognizable form of the Batmobile we see today. which I think most people are familiar with the design of the later Batmobile. And that wasn't an incredibly important thing. Interestingly, the first Batman vehicle was introduced in Detective Comics 31, which was the Bat Gyro, and that was pretty quickly replaced by the Bat Plane, but Batman's vehicles and stuff were something they started to flesh out more as time went on. One thing that changed pretty quickly was the original Bat suit. The original Bat suit was similar to what we know now, definitely kind of a prototype. The ears are hanging out further apart than now. They were a lot more big and pronounced. He had the purple gloves, although in a lot of the issues they were miscolored to be just his bare hands. That's kind of a continuity issue, and that's something I'll get into later, but I think the early coloring wasn't always the best, and there would definitely be a lot of mistakes with the colorization and continuity that involves that, but it's mostly not too noticeable. And then pretty shortly after he introduced with the original suit, they changed it to the blue and gray suit I think people are more familiar with nowadays, that has more or less stuck, slightly changed throughout the years, but is more or less what we would see at least until like the 1980s, with minor alterations here and there. But it would be similar to that from then on out. A lot of Batman's rogues gallery would be introduced fairly early on, although they would be pretty dramatically different from what we know them as nowadays, and they weren't a central focus like they are nowadays, where Batman isn't fighting a lot of like gangsters and street level criminals these days, but back then it was a lot more kind of gangster of the week. What racket is Batman breaking this time? And it's mostly generic gangster stories with Batman kind of figuring out about the mob, breaking it down. Oftentimes Batman has an uncanny ability to know every criminal, yet he doesn't do anything about them a lot of the times. So that's a lot more of what the old stories are, as compared to now, where it's very villain of the week. Although early on we do have the Joker. The Joker, in his early appearances, like his first couple, he was a lot more of like a standard gangster, I would say. He did have like the laughing gas and stuff, but that is kind of like the type of gimmicks we would see early on with some of these characters. Like you have Hugo Strange as well. He would create giant men or death rays or whatever the case may be. But as it went on, Joker started to get a little more comedic and campy, which I think the stories kind of start getting more comedic and campy after a couple years. I think about 2 years in, you'd start to see it like a little more eye-rolling than originally. So Joker changed quite a bit over the years. Then we have like Catwoman. Catwoman as a character appeared pretty early on as well. She appeared in Batman 1, which was the same issue Joker first appeared in. And Catwoman, quite a bit different than today in terms of not only kind of look and aesthetic, but also she wasn't like a martial artist like you'd imagine today. She was more of just a jewel thief, kind of a master of disguise, but she wasn't particularly like cunning or anything. I think it was just kind of the gimmick of like a female thief. Batman kind of has a crush on her or something and is always like, wow, Robin, I accidentally let her go because she's pretty or something. And they did that motif pretty much every time she showed up for whatever reason, which is weird because normally Batman was pretty relentless. I mean, he is today still. And I think that is kind of a trait of Batman that's carried on sort of throughout media throughout the years, in his relationship with Catwoman. Another one that shows up early on is Clayface, although Clayface is dramatically different from today. At the time, he was kind of a play on Boris Karloff. His name is Basil Karlo, so you can kind of see why. He's a horror actor who's a master makeup artist, and he would kind of just wear disguises and try to kill people. But he didn't feel too much out of the ordinary. In terms of Batman's rogues gallery he would fight at the time, if you want to call it that, he didn't feel particularly special, although we know today they definitely expanded that character quite a bit. Scarecrow also showed up pretty early on, and he's kind of similar to what he is today, although definitely his character expanded. At the time he was just kind of trying to use fear, create like protection rackets. The origin's still there. though he didn't use like fear gas in his early appearances. Early on, he would kind of just hold people up with guns and steal their money or offer them protection. You know, pretty similar stuff to what normally we would see, but the time that Scarecrow was introduced, I think they were trying to go for more like costumes and kind of like more gimmick characters than before, because it was getting kind of bland, I think, just having them fight like a gangster every week. So it allowed for more dramatic storytelling and stuff, but essentially he was just kind of a gimmick character at the time, much like you would see like the early Joker and stuff. They'd be expanded later on. Pretty soon after this, we would see the introduction of the Penguin. In 1948, which is still considered the Golden Age, we'd see like the introduction of the Riddler. So a lot of the villains were kind of drip-fed. A lot of the major villains of today that have been greatly expanded. But, you know, a lot of them are here in some form or another within the early Golden Age. One thing I want to comment on is the art. Obviously, like the art in these, it's very hard to credit for sure who did the art. I think Jerry Robinson did some, Bob Kane did some of the early artwork, though it's kind of disputable how much he did, because everything that we've kind of found out about Bob Kane since the Golden Age. But not to get on too much of a tangent, but the art is kind of sketchy compared to nowadays, which is understandable in some ways. It is kind of basic and bland, and I've even read some Golden Age comics that have better art. It's not terrible, it's just not super dynamic for today, and not that I think it really mattered back in the day as much, but definitely our modern sensibilities would say that it's not the greatest artwork. Although I do think there's a level of charm to it. It's just, especially if you read these in like a marathon, I think the artwork can get kind of boring and bland. But that is kind of a problem with a lot of early comic book art, although there are exceptions. But overall it's not too bad. But like I said earlier too, you definitely do have like miscolorizations. Sometimes the art is kind of sketchy. But overall, it's okay for what it is. Along with the art being a little dated at this point, we also do have some interesting spelling and interesting phrases. Definitely the terminology is different, which obviously you got to expect from comics that are 80 years old. So there definitely is some interesting quirks. Like for a while, whenever they said tomorrow, it would be spelled TO-MORROW. So that was always kind of interesting. I don't know if that was a typical way of spelling it back in the day, but it was definitely odd. There's a few odd quirks like that. They definitely say stuff which nowadays has different meanings. I'm sure a lot of people have read about like the Joker's boner comic, where, you know, a boner meant something completely different back then than it would now, so it wouldn't be weird. And there's a lot of little quirks like that, but overall it's still pretty readable, pretty legible. It's just there are some quirks to it, which by modern standards would probably come off as funny or weird. And another thing I'll say about the writing is it is fairly repetitive, as I've kind of been alluding to. A lot of these stories you can pretty much lay out, you know, most of these stories are pretty much beat for beat the same in ways. A lot of the times the first page is Batman and Robin talking. Batman and Robin are doing something, walking around. They notice something weird. This is where our plot comes in. They usually meet a side character who tells them about the crime or whatever. Then they investigate as Batman and Robin. They fight the gangsters one time. They either get away, capture somebody like Batman or Robin, or, you know, in some cases Julie or someone else. And then Batman and Robin finds them, they win, and the rat gets taken down. And that's usually how every issue goes, which makes reading these in a marathon kind of grating, because it's like, okay, I know it's going to happen. A lot of the times at the end they also like to spew some moral stuff at you, where it's like, crime doesn't pay. And it's like, yeah, I get it, man. You say that in every issue. You do the one-page lecture where you and Robin are talking about how crime doesn't pay. It definitely gets a little repetitive, but, you know, that was pretty much old comics anyways. Something you can kind of expect. You know, they were made for children more back in the day, so, you know, it's kind of understandable why they try to do these messages at that point. Another thing that's pretty dated at this point, there's interesting views on some races and, you know, the female gender, which obviously a lot of these comics have. You pretty much couldn't find one back in the day that doesn't have stuff that's minorly racist. But in a couple occasions, Batman runs into Asian characters, and I didn't read till like World War II, and I can only imagine it gets more racially insensitive to Asian characters, but even when he would be like, "This is a man I respect greatly," you would meet him and he'd have like a Fu Manchu mustache. They would draw him yellow. Like, you know, definitely not the most tasteful interpretations, although I don't think there was many things that were overtly racist, at least in the early Batman comics, but that is definitely something. There weren't any black characters, there weren't really any like Latin characters or anything. The only things we really saw in these early issues were occasionally Asian people, and they were kind of like mystic Fu Manchu type characters, which pretty outdated, kind of racist, but, you know, so that's something to look out for, although I wouldn't consider anything like incredibly intentionally racist, probably just the views of the time, which of course kind of leads into how Batman and characters would kind of treat women at the time. I think it's kind of a similar thing where they didn't really mean harm by it, but a lot of the times they'd be like, women are silly and not the smartest, and, you know, they wouldn't really trust what women said and stuff. So that's actually fairly minor in these comics. Like, I've definitely seen more racist and more sexist comics, you know, although for modern standards these are pretty out of date. On top of that, a lot of the love interests are pretty shallow, kind of, in the early issues. We have Julie and Linda are kind of his prime love interests, Julie more so. And it would kind of just be like her dreams to be an actress. Batman would save her, so she would kind of scold Bruce Wayne for being like boring because he didn't do a bunch of superhero stuff and save her, which Batman would usually laugh about and be like, "Silly woman, if she knew I was the Batman, she would be completely surprised." So, you know, a lot of that stuff's kind of outdated, but overall, it is what it is. It was the 1930s, the 1940s. You kind of have to expect that stuff. So, would I recommend reading early Golden Age Batman comics? Probably not. I read about 800 pages worth of them, so I feel like I have a pretty good idea of what you're getting. It feels very repetitive. It gets kind of grating and boring. The art has a charm to it, but it's not the greatest, so it's nothing like... You're not going to notice anything different, really, between the issues on art. You're not going to get any, like, incredible splash pages. The artwork is pretty static. The writing is very repetitive. I would say it's kind of fun and interesting to see early appearances of some of these characters, so I would recommend kind of looking at some of the things you're interested in. Like, I think it's worth checking out like Detective Comics 27, Detective Comics 38. Even Batman 1 has a lot of interesting stuff to it, because you have like the introduction of Joker and Catwoman. So I think there's definitely worth in some of the early issues, but I would kind of exercise the caution. It is out of date. I wouldn't really consider it worth reading in a long chunk, but, you know, if you want to check out a few of the adventures, I would kind of just look at what you're interested in the Batman lore and kind of read like those early first appearances, or just find some stories that interest you and it might be worth checking out. But I definitely wouldn't consider marathoning them unless you're very interested in like the history of comics and want to kind of learn about the early appearances of Batman and how these characters were portrayed. Anyways, so that was my first comic book retrospective. I've got a few ideas for videos coming up. I'm trying to read a good amount of material before I do these. So right now, these will probably come out once every 2 or 3 weeks, or whenever I have inspiration. But once quarantine and all this is over, it'll probably take a little longer because I'm usually trying to read a good amount of arcs or read an entire run or something. So bear with me on that. I'm definitely open to recommendations. I do have a few ideas for where I'm going to go in the future with this series. I have my next video lined up I'm going to start working on pretty soon here, so expect that in about a month. But I definitely welcome suggestions. I'd be happy to look at stuff I've looked at before, or if you got any recommendations for good series that's worth looking at, I could definitely take a look at that, so let me know. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you guys next time.